Look closely at this island. It is, by every metric of real estate and technology, the most expensive piece of ecological sanctuary on Earth. No apex predators patrol these ridgelines. No harsh winters trigger starvation here. Every single individual of this critically endangered species is microchipped, catalogued, and tracked by $1 million network of telemetry towers and dedicated human caretakers. It is an environment designed by pure human empathy, a paradise where the brutal, blood-soaked laws of natural selection have been completely outlawed. And it is a biological graveyard. In our frantic, desperate bid to wipe out every ounce of suffering from the wild, we accidentally committed the ultimate ecological error. We bypassed the code of survival. We did not kill these creatures with malice or exploitation. We sterilized them with absolute kindness. To understand how human mercy became a weapon of biological mass destruction, you have to look at the landscape of our own idealism. For over half a century, the global conservation community watched this defenseless species slide toward the absolute zero of extinction. The initial response was intuitive, noble, and deeply human. If something is dying, protect it. We gathered the surviving remnants, airlifted them away from the teeth and claws of their historical predators, and placed them onto ultra-isolated sanctuary islands. We built them fortresses. We replaced their volatile, seasonal food supplies with an endless, automated buffet of high-calorie, nutrient-dense dietary pellets designed by the world's leading animal nutritionists. We gave them absolute safety. But evolution does not look at safety the way we do. Evolution does not recognize mercy. By making their world perfectly comfortable, we did something far worse than introducing a new predator. We broke the ancient, invisible machinery that tells a living creature how to replicate itself. By the time the third year of the Sanctuary Initiative drew to a close, scientists noticed a terrifying trend. The animals weren't dying. In fact, their individual lifespans were breaking records. They were growing fat, sleek, and utterly indifferent. The problem was that they had completely stopped breeding. The sanctuary nests were entirely empty. To find out why, conservation endocrinologists began capturing females and extracting blood panels. What they uncovered remains one of the most haunting discoveries in modern evolutionary biology. The animals' reproductive systems were completely dormant, shut down at a foundational molecular level. In nature, the mammalian and avian reproductive system is governed by a delicate, high-stakes chemical relay known as the HPG axis, the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis. This pathway does not simply run on a fixed mechanical clock. It acts like an environmental antenna, constantly measuring the hostility, volatility, and demands of the outside ecosystem to determine if it is safe to bring new life into the world. For millions of years, this species evolved under the constant, low-level pressure of survival anxiety. The snap of a twig, the scent of a hidden predator, the localized scarcity of a winter drought. These harsh realities trigger precise, baseline bursts of stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. In primitive evolutionary blueprints, these low-level glucocorticoid spikes do not suppress life, they pace it. They act as the biological keys required to jolt the hypothalamus into releasing gonadotropin-releasing hormone, or GnRH. GnRH is the master chemical signal that tells the body to begin ovulation, to seek a mate, to take the monumental risk of reproduction. But inside our $1 million sanctuary, there was no fear, there was no hunger, there was no exhaustion. By isolating these creatures from every systemic threat, we plunged their bodies into a state of profound metabolic stasis. Their brains looked around at the endless abundance, felt the absolute absence of survival stress and miscalculated. The endocrine system concluded that the individual was already in an optimal, permanent survival state, prioritizing individual longevity over the biological hazard of mating. The evolutionary switches simply clicked off. The animal's body literally forgot why it was alive. And yet, this endocrine stasis was only the prelude to a much darker genetic trap. If you are watching this and thinking that a simple adjustment to their diet could fix the issue, you are underestimating the terrifying mathematics of evolutionary biology. Because when scientists tried to solve the hormone problem by giving the animals even more premium, high-protein supplements, they triggered a second, completely irreversible evolutionary catastrophe. They stepped squarely into the male bias trap. In 1973, two evolutionary biologists proposed a radical theory known as the Trivers-Willard hypothesis. It states that natural selection forces parents to bias the sex ratio of their offspring based on their own physical condition and resource availability. If a mother is struggling, malnourished, and living on the razor's edge of survival, her body will naturally favour the production of female offspring. Why? Because a female offspring is a safe evolutionary bet. She will almost always manage to find a mate and pass on at least some of her mother's genes. But if a mother is living in absolute unnatural resource abundance, if she is hypernourished, fat, and utterly insulated from stress, her biological programming takes a massive gamble. Her body calculates that she has the luxury to invest in producing massive, hyper-aggressive, high-energy male competitors who can dominate a habitat and father hundreds of offspring. When our conservation teams flooded the sanctuary island with custom-engineered, super-enriched protein pellets, they unknowingly tripped this ancient evolutionary wire. The pampered, stress-free mothers' bodies looked at the unnatural nutrient abundance and shifted production. Year after year, decade after decade, the sanctuary nests did not hatch a balanced generation. They hatched males. Up to 85% of all new births on the island were male. Think about the horror of that statistic from a population standpoint. You are spending millions of dollars an hour to save an endangered species, and your interventions are accidentally engineering a hyper-aggressive society of bachelor males. An army of sons with no daughters to mate with. A generation of evolutionary dead ends waiting quietly in a pristine forest for an ending that human empathy had written for them. By the time the scientific community realized what the Trivers-Willard effect was doing to the sanctuary island, the genetic damage was already systemic. Without natural selective pressures to weed out weak or deleterious traits, genetic drift began to accelerate at 3 times the speed seen in the wild. The species wasn't just failing to reproduce. The few individuals that were born were becoming physically frailer, less adaptive, and increasingly dependent on human medical intervention to survive the basic acts of existence. We had built an ecological greenhouse, and our plants could no longer survive outside the glass. It was during the peak of this crisis that a desperate team of field researchers proposed an intervention so counterintuitive, so inherently violent, that it split the international conservation community down the middle. They realized that if safety was the mechanism of sterilization, then the only cure left was terror. They initiated what can only be described as a psychological warfare campaign against the endangered species. They stopped providing the high-protein buffet. They deliberately restricted caloric intake, forcing the animals to forage through the dense brush for days just to find basic sustenance. But more importantly, They introduced the shadow of death back into the paradise. Researchers installed massive networks of hidden, high-fidelity speakers throughout the sanctuary. At random intervals during the dead of night, they blasted the visceral, blood-chilling hunting calls of the species' historical apex predators. They laced the nesting zones with synthesized predator urine and left the preserved pelts of dead carnivores hanging in the branches of the trees. The ethical fallout was immediate. Animal rights groups were horrified by the deliberate traumatization of a highly vulnerable species. But the biological data told a story that humanity was forced to look at. The animals that were subjected to this systematic terror, the ones whose hearts pounded in their chests, whose blood surged with sudden, desperate spikes of adrenaline and baseline cortisol, underwent a profound internal transformation. The chemical machinery woke up. The sudden presence of threat shook the HPG axis out of its decades-long slumber. The hypothalamus began firing rhythmic, powerful pulses of GnRH down into the pituitary gland. The females entered estrus. For the first time in an entire generation, natural mating behavior returned to the forest floor. And because their diets had been drastically restricted to simulate natural scarcity, the mothers' bodies stopped producing exclusively male competitors. The sex ratio swung back to a perfect, natural 50-50 equilibrium. The terror didn't destroy them. The terror was the only thing that remembered how to keep them alive. We are left to look at the wreckage of our own idealism. The permanent reproductive collapse of these populations stands as a haunting monument to human arrogance, a warning etched directly into the endocrine systems of the creatures we tried to possess with our love. 1.8. We treated the wild as if it were a broken machine, a collection of broken parts that could be repaired by applying limitless comfort, safety, and nourishment. But life is not a machine. Life is a beautifully balanced, hyper-complex network of tension, held together by the very pressures, struggles, and dangers that we sought to eliminate. When we insulate a vulnerable species from every harsh reality of natural selection, we do not save them from extinction. We strip away the very crucible that defined them in the first place. 8.12. The quietest places on Earth are not the landscapes devastated by our corporate greed or our industrial malice. They are the pristine sanctuaries built by our absolute devotion. We wanted to build a world entirely free of suffering. In doing so, we accidentally built a world entirely free of a future.